Hey you! Are you sad?
Emotionally or existentially?
Are you so numb to good things that short of stabbing yourself to feel something, you need the warm embrace of childhood nostalgia? Yeah! Then get over to your local ma-and-pa murdering conglomerate big box retailer to fork over your blood-toiled income for a copy of Disney Pixar's Toy Story 2, the video game Buzz Lightyear to the rescue. Woody's been kidnapped, and it's up to you to destroy a bunch of other people's stuff until they give them back to you. Team up with your buddies that we can't name because Disney didn't want to pay the copyright holders like Spuds McSum Assembly Required, Animal Farm, and we can make a Jurassic Park joke here, but we can't call him Rex in order to collect MacGuffins and watch clips from the movie, which you can also buy at Walmart or the R-Zone at Toys R Us. What are you still doing with your buzzed lighter? What, do you think you're good because you have Clonky Dong 64 and Crash Bandisnoots at home?
Well, kinda.
Are you sure about that? Disney Pixar's Toy Story 2, the video game Buzz Lightyear to the rescue. And while you're at it, buy some of the other Toy Story 2 merchandise we've been and will continue to subliminally advertise to your feeble, fleshy brains. Buy things, just buy things, make like in sync and buy.
Where do these keep coming from? Hey everyone, 'tis I, Niche. You know, I recently noticed that when people talk about 3D platformers from the 90s and early 2000s, they usually are only referring to the same handful or two of games. You've got your Super Mario 64 retrospectives, your Bubsy 3D rage reviews, and your coverage of other iconic games that I'll let the names of scroll to my right until I finish the sentence right now. Anyway, I found that really interesting because it suggests the idea that we're only looking at the genre in terms of its highs and lows as opposed to within the scope of its entire picture. Now, there are obviously outliers to this, but it feels like a lot of those videos themselves are also trying to pin their subjects as belonging within the canon that I just described. In other words, I noticed that a lot of the coverage I found online for 3D platformers was obsessed with whether or not a game was exceptional or disgraceful, whether or not it was good or bad in black and white terms. Which, you know, makes sense. I mean, it's pretty hard to sell someone on something if you're only gonna describe it as being kind of maybe sort of really good, maybe. But at the same time, it got me thinking about the games that are in the middle of the pack. The games that you might dare say are mediocre. It made me ask myself whether or not I should avoid something just because it isn't the best example of its own genre. To put it another way, whether or not we should avoid the high C's of the world in favor of the B's or A's, or to put it in yet another way, whether we should avoid the high C's of the world in favor of the Hawaiian punches and Kool-Aids out there. Anyway, that's all been a way of saying that I'll be talking about Toy Story 2's licensed video game today.
Released in 1999, Disney Pixar's Toy Story 2, Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue is a mouthful to say and is also the tie-in video game for the Pixar Animation Studios movie Toy Story 2. It was developed by Traveler's Tales, who had also worked on the video game adaptation of the first Toy Story movie and was released for the N64, PlayStation 1, PC, and Macintosh in tandem with the film, with the next-gen port for the Sega Dreamcast coming out about a year later. In it, you take control of Buzz Lightyear as he runs through 15 levels to try and rescue Woody from his kidnapper, Mcwhiggin and Stinky Pete. All along the way, you'll visit various areas from the movie, battle characters from it alongside brand new ones designed just for this adventure, and watch snippets from the movie in between stages too. Interestingly, there are actually some fairly major differences between the title's 5 releases. A lot of them come down to the sort of reasons you'd expect these versions to feature changes, such as the limited cartridge space on the N64 leading to lower quality music or the removal of FMV sequences and what have you, but it does mean that every release of the game has its own unique flavor. Either way, the music's also swapped out on some stages on the Dreamcast version, and the game features minor graphical changes across the board due to the shading capabilities of each platform it was released on. The game was also the subject of controversy when it came out in the US due to featuring a villain that, well, let's just say fell in line with a racial stereotype for Latinos due to him having a mustache, rocking a bandolier, and wearing a sombrero. It culminated in a protest being held outside of its publisher Activision's California headquarters, and even led to Traveler's Tales replacing the character with a blonde-haired cowboy for the game's international release that I've nicknamed Andy as a nod to the character from Toy Story and Spike's lookalike in Cowboy Bebop. However, while it is cool that they did that, Activision and Disney also ended up refusing to recall the game in the US or offer an updated SKU to any of its retailers. And based off of what I could find online, they may not have even updated the N64 version of the game at all. Upon its release, Toy Story 2 was met with a healthy spread of positive to middling and negative reviews across every platform it was available on. For example, while Greg Orlando at Next Gen Magazine gave the Dreamcast version a scathing 1 out of 5-star review and damned the game to the quote-unquote Isle of Misfit Toys, GameSpy's review for the same version gave it a much more forgiving 6.5 out of 10, despite being a bit fixated on the fact that the kids game for kids didn't have the same kind of appeal for people that are old enough to drive as it did for its intended audience. Of all the versions released, the PlayStation 1 version featured the best marks of the bunch, with the German publication Video Games, one of several German review outlets that I historically only see give negative reviews to games that I think are pretty good, giving it a weirdly high 84 out of 100. And in the review itself, the delightfully Americaned up reviewer Christian ultimately said that it's, quote, an absolutely fluently designed game that no jump and run freak who also likes to puzzle a little should miss out on. Additionally, while it's fairly common for licensed games to eventually just go out of print and fade into relative obscurity, Sony's been weirdly nice to this Disney licensed game. In fact, it has a spot on what I can only imagine to be a small list of games that can be played on every PlayStation console, either through backwards compatibility in the case of the PS2 or a straight up digital re-release in the case of the PS3, PSP, PlayStation Vita, PS4, and even the PS5.
Oh my god! Yes!
It was even one of the launch titles for PlayStation Plus's 2022 revamp to compete with Xbox Game Pass.
So I actually grew up playing this game quite a bit on my family's computer when I was growing up. I never got that far into it, and I honestly just ran around in circles more than anything, but it was a really formative game for me, and it's one that I do fondly remember because of that. I even went as far as buying the same exact controller that I used as a kid to play the game, and even though I ended up playing it on PlayStation 1, I'm really glad that I did because, I mean, look at this thing. It's so weird. This controller's the strangest thing you'll ever see. It has a nub that you would have to screw in on top of the D-pad to simulate analog control. It didn't actually have analog control, but it made you want to think that you did because what the is this thing?
Toy Story 2 was the second 3D game that I ever remember playing, with the first one being Super Mario 64. But despite it being a game that I remember liking as a kid and spending copious amounts of time goofing off in, I don't remember anything being particularly remarkable about it. Frankly, I ended up forgetting about the game by the time I was 8 or 9, and I never really thought to revisit it until fairly recently. However, I may actually be in the minority about this because the game actually has a bit of a cult reputation online, with several people consistently recommending it to fans of Rare's 3D collect-a-thons or fans of games like Spyro. So I figured now was as good a time as any to revisit the game and to figure out where I stand on it, especially on account of it being one of the easier to find games that I'll have covered on my channel. Going into this video though, I wasn't particularly sure of what angle I could take with it though, as until I actually replayed the thing, I didn't expect myself to enjoy it that much. I honestly think a part of me was concerned about whether or not I'd be overly unforgiving towards it on account of it being a licensed game and the multitude of higher quality but similar titles you could play instead of it. I mean, stacked against those games, I was genuinely worried how it would hold up in a beat-by-beat breakdown of their features and enjoyability, and I genuinely felt guilty about the idea of potentially being really negative about something that a lot of people seem to like.
And then it hit me. It doesn't need to be better. It can literally just be worse than them. Saying as much honestly doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things, nor is it really a condemnation against the quality of the game itself. And frankly, that really shouldn't come as a shock to anyone because let's not forget, this is a licensed game. This was literally made to be released a week before the movie hit theaters. The fact that it's as playable as it is with that in mind is actually really impressive.
So in today's video, I'm gonna try and take things a bit easier than I have in a while. I'm gonna try not to give you some overarching thesis on my philosophy towards game design or anything too outlandish. I mean, like, yeah, okay, spoiler alert, I actually will by the end of the video, but I'm gonna try and keep it short and sweet for once. Instead, I'm just gonna dedicate some time to revisiting a game that, at least in my opinion, wasn't all that spectacular, but interestingly may still be worth your time because of that. You know, because games can still be a bit messy while still being a lot of fun to play, and they don't always need to reinvent the wheel to be worth checking out. Those things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What are you playing these days? Yeah, that's it. That's the question. What have you been playing lately, and what do you think you're gonna play next? Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. On top of that, feel free to subscribe and share the video with your friends or anywhere you see fit if you're enjoying what you see so far, as it goes a long way in helping the channel grow. You could also subscribe to my Patreon or donate to my Buy Me a Coffee if you want some bonus goodies and want to support the channel that way too. And with that out of the way, on with the video. Alright, so right off the bat, the version of the game I'll be covering today is the American release of the PlayStation version. I was originally gonna go with the Dreamcast one for my review on account of it being the last one to get put on the market, and as such was the most refined one of the game put out, but I ultimately thought that the PS1 game would make more sense since it's the one you can easily purchase on the PlayStation 4 and 5. Although, for the record, I don't actually know whether or not that's the patched international version of the game or if it's the original one with the culturally insensitive enemy in it.
Okay then.
Toy Story 2 takes you through a rough, and I do mean rough, retelling of the events of its namesake. Basically, Woody's been kidnapped by What an Asshole Games, topical I know, and it's up to Buzz and his buddies from the Play School of Hard Knocks to rescue him before he's graded, traded, and slated for deep storage forever. However, on account of the game being called Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue and not Buzz Lightyear and his merry men to the rescue, you're only able to play as the iconic Space Ranger while his friends appear as NPCs in each of the game's 12 platforming stages. They're a bit like Knuckles and Tails from Sonic 3D Blast in that sense, which is a comparison that I'm only just now realizing is somewhat poignant on account of both games being by Traveler's Tales. The game's divided into several acts that culminate in a boss stage and more or less coincides with each of the major acts in the movie that it's based on. Act 1 follows Buzz and company as they sneak out of Andy's house to go after Woody and his kidnapper, who is played by Wayne Knight and reprises his role in the game via reused audio from the film. The second and third act focuses on them infiltrating Al's toy barn and later his apartment, and the fourth act focuses on the gang trying to save Woody and Jesse from Stinky Pete at the airport. In between each of the stages are select clips from the movie that try to add a bit of context to the story by reminding people who've seen Toy Story 2 just where they are in the movie and why their characters are there in the first place. And for those of you who decided to play the N64 version of the game for whatever reason, you don't even get those cutscenes. Because N64 cartridges were notorious for their limited storage capabilities, every FMV sequence from the PS1, Dreamcast, and PC versions got scrapped in favor of some truly budget screenshots and text to fill players in on what's happening. Though, to be fair, I actually think I might prefer it to what everyone else got. Sure, full motion video is a lot prettier to look at, but those slideshows sometimes do a better job of actually telling the story than a random clip from the movie without all of its context does. On top of that, it feels especially nostalgic because a lot of games from back in the day did that, and that gives it a bit of a humdrum appeal that you don't get from the FMVs. It's no Toy Story 2 multimedia read-along, mind you, but it's fairly serviceable nonetheless. Ultimately, it's fine either way though, since most of the people playing the game probably already saw the movie to begin with, or seeing as it's a kid's movie and all, at least skimmed the read-along storybook that they bought at that year's Scholastic Book Fair. What you can't do with a copy of Toy Story on a video home system tape or digital video disc, however, is play it. I mean, you can, but just not in that way. Like, you know what I mean? Each of the levels have 5 Pizza Planet tokens in them that you'll need to collect in order to unlock the next stage and eventually gain access to that act's boss fight. If that sounds really familiar to you, it's because it's the same basic formula that's been used across collect-a-thons from the mid to late 90s through the 2000s as a whole. It's the Power Stars from Super Mario 64, the puzzle pieces from Banjo-Kazooie, and the Power Cells from the first Jak and Daxter game. You can unlock these tokens by completing any number of quests available to you that run the gamut from participating in a race or time trial to beating a mini-boss, completing a puzzle, finding 50 coins, or collecting 5 lost MacGuffins for the MacGuffin Man. You'll also have a ton of toys and enemies to fight along the way, which you can dispose of with the use of Buzz's now lethal laser light, except in the cutscene the game features where it's explicitly harmless again, stomp technique that we legally can't call a ground pound, but is, yeah, basically Mario's ground pound and a spinning move. It's a fairly robust skill set for the guy, and one that can actually be tweaked slightly thanks to the ability to both charge your laser and spin, as well as pick up a power-up for your laser, and the fact that you can pop Buzz into a first-person mode where you get access to free aim and can also straight up lock on to enemies. In order to unlock the next stage, you'll need to collect at least 1 Pizza Planet token on your last unlocked level, and in order to access one of the game's major boss battles, you'll require a predetermined number of Pizza Planet tokens. If you plan on doing the bare minimum to get through this game, you'll basically be best off collecting 2 or 3 tokens per level, and then maybe going back to those stages later in case you needed a few more to get access to a boss.
I need one more f***ing H!
In order to battle the game's first boss, which is a battle with a plane that references North by Northwest of all things, you'll need to make sure that you have 3 tokens. For the second boss, you'll go up against a bafflingly weird slime monster and need 10 tokens. The third boss is a giant UFO that looks straight out of 1953's War of the Worlds and will require 18 tokens. 28 tokens will get you through the door to fight Zurg, who's the fourth boss, and you'll require a whopping 40 tokens to fight Stinky Pete and the Funky Bunch, who comprise the final encounter in the game. As far as the selection of bosses in the game itself goes though, I really like what we have here. While the battles themselves do feel a bit by the numbers and aren't exactly creative, the actual boss designs that were selected all feel great and like they organically fit in with what the story calls for. We're fighting a model plane because the stages leading up to the encounter took place in Andy's house and backyard respectively, the sort of place where you might find a model plane. The slime monster exists because Flubber was a box office disappointment and the mouse demands retribution. The UFO fight makes sense because we're in Al's Toy Barn and because of the whole Buzz Lightyear is sorta supposed to be Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon thing. The fourth boss was literally in the movie and just had to be recontextualized a bit, and the fifth boss makes sense because it was also kind of in the movie. Unfortunately though, even though you do have a fairly good variety of moves at your disposal, which includes a double jump I forgot to mention by the way, the controls themselves leave a bit to be desired. Don't get me wrong, they're responsive and they do feel relatively intuitive, but it's just that they're also a bit too sensitive for their own good. The game kinda lacks the sort of analog input that helps you feel truly in control of your character. One of the big innovations that Super Mario 64 brought to the table was the fact that it was designed to showcase the N64's analog stick, which by 1999 had already been emulated and iterated on by much of the competition that this game was released on. It gave you the ability to control the speed of your movement in a way that made traversing a 3D space feel natural to the player. But Toy Story 2, on the other hand, lacks that sort of nuance in its control. Even though it does feature analog inputs, it has a bit too much of a dead zone on the stick itself to make it feel particularly comfortable. On top of that, it only seems to have 2 speeds for you to flick between, which means that the implementation of these controls feels a bit half-cooked too. Honestly, while I was scrubbing through a lot of the footage I captured of the game while I was writing this review, I genuinely had trouble telling when I was using the D-pad to control Buzz versus the analog stick. To be clear though, I'm not saying that the controls are necessarily bad, I'm just saying that they weren't fully realized. Hell, if you want to get existential about it, it may even be realistic for the controls to be this way. After all, Buzz Lightyear's a toy, right? Maybe his being made of plastic made it so that he can't physically move his legs with the sort of grace and control that a real bag of meat, flesh, and bones would. I realize that almost definitely wasn't their intention with that, but hey, if you're gonna make a game about being a plastic children's plaything, you may as well go all in and give us the experience of lacking in fine motor control, right?
You know, somewhere in the middle of writing all of that, it dawned on me that the French name for Toy Story is probably something really existential, such as L'Histoire de la Jouet, or translated literally, Story of the Toys. Which sounds really random when you think about it, but is actually a great title for the movie because, yeah, Toy Story 1 and 2 are fairly existential.
À quoi bon vouloir prolonger l'inévitable? Tu languis sur l'étagère du haut et puis un jour, c'est le grenier.
Now, after saying something like that, I'm sure you're expecting me to mention that Toy Story 2's soundtrack is a moody blend of Euro-influenced jazz and explorative prog music or something, but, no, it's honestly just some generic late 90s video game music. I don't mean that in a bad way or anything either. It's literally just the type of 90s platformer music you were probably expecting from it. Aside from licensing Randy Newman's You've Got a Friend in Me for the menus, the game's music runs the gamut of being somewhat mischievous and orchestral to electronic and energizing, big band swing, childlike and playful, as well as heroic and epic. There's nothing wrong with any of it, and it does suit the gameplay pretty well, but I guess I'm also just saying that I doubt much of it'll stick with you once you turn the game off. I don't know, I guess it would have been more memorable to save Woody to Hallo Gallo though, but that could just be me. T.S. Eliot Simulator 2, or whatever it's called, also features voice samples from each of the characters that were from the movie. They're literally ripped straight out of the film, and even though they honestly play a bit too often for their own good and don't have anywhere near a large enough sample size to not outstay their welcome by the end of the first or second level, it was a nice touch on account of the multi-layered authenticity that it lends the game. I won't pretend that they don't get annoying though, and that they don't just end up reminding me of that South Park episode where they canned Chef's voice for the entire episode.
Hello there, children.
Hey, Chef.
Well, how about I meet you boys after work and we can make love?
What?
The graphics themselves, though, are way better. They may not look like much, and by the time the Dreamcast version came out, they looked straight up antiquated for the hardware it was running on, but I think they're full of life, or lack thereof given the subject matter, and have a lot of charm going for them. I mentioned that I grew up playing this game on PC as a kid, and while that's true, something about the PlayStation version, which was the ugliest one of the bunch, feels especially nostalgic for me. The chunky and blocky graphics, coupled with the heaps upon heaps of dithering slathered on top of everything, really helps root the game in the late 90s, and as a result, may actually feel like the most authentic version of the game for people looking to experience it for the first time. Whichever way you end up experiencing the game though, if you decide to, will be fine. The graphics are clear and it was seldom hard to decipher what you were looking at. Across the board, and aside from some pretty nightmarish character models, the game just looks pretty good. Speaking of good, I also really liked the theming of the game too. If anything, it may even be the best part of the game by far for me due to how it's likely the game's most unique aspect. Because the game revolves around toys coming to life and exploring the human world, it's rife with tons of creative and visually memorable stage themes. Stuff that, without the pretense of being in a cartoony game about toys, would have ended up being a boring premise for a level in a video game. Stages like Andy's house or the airport are great stage themes, not just for a Toy Story licensed game, but for a 3D platformer in general because it takes the familiar and shifts our relationship with it. At the risk of sounding really pretentious, something like that just feels compatible with the idea of a 3D platformer, especially from the era this one came out in because it describes the very thing that the genre itself was doing at the time. And if you really want to get in the weeds with me, you could even argue that the game's water mechanics are also similar in the same way that they subvert the 3D collect-a-thon's usual trope of forcing you to remember to breathe lest you want to drown by foregoing water mechanics in the first place. Like, okay, yeah, there is some gravity tweaking going on and there's some great looking squash and stretch added on top of everything, but that's literally it. You're a toy. You don't have to breathe. What I'm trying to say is that it's really cool to have things you're familiar with getting turned on their head, even if it's in as minuscule of a way as things suddenly being larger than they're supposed to. I don't know, it just has this sort of folksy, Rugratsy appeal to me that I really appreciated. I love when ordinary stuff is turned into something fantastic, and that was the exact feeling I got from this game and its levels. Plus, the game does a good job of making you actually want to explore these stages and keeping them from becoming too confusing to navigate in the process. Because this is supposed to be the real world we're exploring, things are organized and categorized in ways that just make sense. Which is great because the game's made for kids and all, but it's especially awesome because it allows some of these levels to get pretty large in their scope and size while still being pretty easy to find your way through. With tons of zip lines to use, power-ups to unlock that directly reference the movie and help you traverse to previously unreachable areas and platforming sections, you really do feel like you're a toy that has to think on his feet in order to get where you want to go. And sometimes this may even involve a bit of creative thinking, like in the construction yard level when you can get a hold of an extra life by leaping off the top of the stage and landing on top of a building. Stuff like that was really fun because it felt like it was playing with the convention of fall damage in platformers by A, not giving you any fall damage to fear in the first place because
You are a toy!
and B, rewarding you for trying to f around and find out. However, if I'm being honest, it's also kinda weird that you don't take fall damage though. I mean, after all, it's not like the plastics that are used to make toys are famously durable or anything. If anything, they're the exact opposite of that.
Well, of course, there's some assembly required.
Also, wasn't it a literal plot point in the first movie that Buzz's arm broke off when he tried to escape from Sid's house? It's hardly a big deal that this is a thing to begin with, but it's also just kind of funny to see it be an element of the game when the thing it's adapting basically established that it shouldn't be the case in the first place. Hell, the series is more or less about exploring the impermanence of being a toy. Alright, so based off the first part of this review, you'd be right to assume that this game does quite a bit right and that it's an enjoyable experience. And if I were to cut things off there and just ended my review here, I'd probably say that I was wrong to call it mid and that it's a genuinely good game that's worth your time.
Good.
However,
No, however, just be wrong. Just stand there in your wrongness and be wrong and get used to it.
However, even though I was just praising the game, I also couldn't help but feel like it was doing the bare minimum for a lot of its runtime. For example, while I did love the game's theming and the designs of many of the stages themselves, they could have gone further with some of their ideas within them. For instance, there's the fact that there aren't any humans in any of these stages. Every level is just an empty arena with random toys scattered throughout the place, and while it's more than enough to get the job done, it would have been really cool to see some humans get thrown into the mix. Like, what if you had to avoid Andy's mom during the backyard stage or something? If you get caught by her, you could have gotten picked up and sent back to the starting area of the stage in a toy box or something, and that would have added a bit of tension to the game. And the same goes for Al's apartment, where you could have had to hide from him or something lest you want to hear Wayne Knight chase you around the character's home and cost you a life. It could have made for a fun set piece in the same way that the gun truck chase in Sonic Adventure 2's first level is extremely memorable. It may sound like nitpicking or like I'm just pitching something for the sake of pitching something, but I think it would have given the game a much needed shot in the arm. Now, you could make the argument that a movie tie-in game for kids is the last place a developer should try and reinvent the wheel, and yeah, you'd be right. In fact, you should probably check out what the next chapter is about while I load this revolver I'm holding for my friend Chekhov.
It's a loner.
But I don't really think it should stop me from making a suggestion like that due to how it relates to one of the bigger criticisms I have towards the game, which is the lack of variety in it. Plus, going back to the kids part of the argument, while it does make sense to keep the game a bit simple and approachable for the youngins in the audience, it wouldn't have needed to have come with that large of a penalty in the first place. The game could have easily turned it into a minor set piece in one part of the stage and tied a Pizza Planet token to it or something with the expectation that less experienced players will just avoid it. If younger players were anything like I was when I was a kid, aka a regular old Chucky Finster type, that just means they would have stepped around those harder to complete challenges in the same way that I avoided the chain chomp in Super Mario 64. Because again, I was a coward. It also would have been an opportunity for those younger players to actually get a type of challenge that didn't come down to having the reflexes to do something so much as just figuring out what they needed to do. And that would allow them to gently test their critical thinking skills in a way that would have made the game a really gratifying experience, and maybe just a bit like the Toy Story 2 Activity Center or something, which you can pick up at your local CompUSA. Without it, the game just ends up feeling especially samey. There's good attention to verticality in a number of the levels, others are heavier on the acrobatics, and some combine the two fairly well, but they still end up blending together in terms of their design. The biggest differentiator between many of the stages is the environments themselves, and while they do succeed in giving every stage its own identity, it left me wanting something a bit more premium. While the stages you'll be in will change, the missions you do in them hardly ever will, and it made playing more than a level or two of the game at a time a bit boring. I think that doing something as simple as adding one or two more quest types to the game and shuffling the available ones on each stage up a bit would have been enough to add a bit of variety to things, but even then, the game probably would have needed a bit more than that in order to truly feature the type of rising and falling in its pace that I really wished it had. One of the best parts of the first Toy Story game was the fact that it threw different mission objectives at you for every level, as well as a few different gameplay types for good measure. It felt immersive, and it made you feel incentivized to keep playing the game in order to figure out what was coming next. In Toy Story 2 though, you're just Buzz Lightyear, and that never really happens, which is a huge shame because there were opportunities throughout the story of Toy Story 2 to take some inspiration from. The lack of variety is far from the game's only problem though. Regardless of the fact that the stages do feature some good platforming challenges and have a fairly decent variety of enemies for you to go toe to toe with, the game's camera will probably give you more trouble than anything in any of the game's stages could ever hope to. Due to this game being designed with multiple single analog input consoles in mind, it maps camera controls to the shoulder buttons, at least on the PS1 version, and gives you the ability to swing it from left to right around Buzz at any given moment. It's fairly in line with what you'd expect for controlling a game camera from the era, but it still has a few minor issues in the way that it's anchored and angled around Buzz Lightyear.
On paper, it may sound like a good idea to put the camera here because it does show you your surroundings to some degree, and it does a pretty good job of making you feel like you're actually looking at the world through Buzz Lightyear's eyes. However, in implementation, it was actually a pretty crappy choice.
For starters, centering Buzz on the screen makes it slightly harder to see what's directly in front of him, and it means that you'll be running with a blind spot at any given moment unless you want to wrestle with the camera all the time. And while I won't deny that the angle the action takes place from sells the scale of the environment you're in, it also makes depth perception and gauging your relationship to your surroundings a bit less intuitive than a more angular camera position would have. This is especially true on the PlayStation 1 version too, since it has a lower native resolution and texture warping on top of this problem. Plus, positioning the camera back from a higher angle wouldn't necessarily ruin that perspective the current camera position's trying to convey. Sure, it would change the perspective on a literal level, but an alternate higher angle would allow us to see what we're doing more clearly and give us a greater view of the scale of the world itself. This may just be a subjective thing, but if you want a decent simulation and example of what I'm getting at, try booting up Super Mario 64 and compare using the default camera in the game as opposed to the toggleable one that puts you directly behind Mario. If you do, you'll see that a number of easy jumps and attacking enemies becomes harder than it needs to be on account of the lower spatial awareness that comes with that camera angle. I know I tend to use film as an example a lot on my channel, and that's honestly just because it's what I studied in college and because some of the same basic concepts are compatible with game design due to them both being visual mediums, but I'm reminded of a video essay I saw years ago on Jackie Chan fight scenes here. The TLDR of that video is that wide shots with less cutting tends to convey action better in film due to how it keeps the information being shown to the viewer clear and concise. And I think the same basic principle applies to camera positioning in a 3D platformer. The added clarity of a higher and further back angle may appear less exciting because it isn't as in your face and stimulating as the close one, much as a fight scene between characters done in a few medium or wide shots may appear less exciting than a heavily cut action set piece does, but it's easier for our brains to parse and become immersed in because of that same lack of stimulation. We may be in for fewer surprises with the, for lack of a better term, boring camera angle, but it allows us to actually understand what we can and can't do without any unwanted surprises coming our way or without us needing to fiddle with the camera position ourselves mid-gameplay.
When you shoot this way, everything looks more impressive because action and reaction are in the same frame. Notice how you can always see Jackie, the car, and the wall at the same time. But a similar stunt from Rush Hour 3 never includes all of the elements in the same shot, and it doesn't work.
And for putting up with my little movie tangent of the day, here's a shot of Jackie Chan getting his face punched into some twice as thick as the real thing prop glass. Hope you enjoyed that. I don't want to mislead you guys and make you think it's this huge problem with the game though. I mean, it kinda is, and it was probably my biggest gripe with it, but it wasn't in a way that made the game completely unplayable or anything. It was just a weird little decision that the developers made that I found somewhat suspect. Plus, Toy Story 2 actually does have an alternate camera option that tries to adjust the angle for you while you're playing, though I would urge that you try and avoid it as it takes away your ability to adjust the camera for yourself unless you're at a full stop and can be fairly derpy on its own. In their defense though, it was 1999. 3D game development was still in its infancy and people were so terrified of the Millennium Problem that they had friggin' Spock make a Y2K Doomsday Prep video, so like, I think we can cut them some slack. They were still just figuring out how to work with perspective in the medium back then, and as I alluded to earlier, the PlayStation 1's hardware itself probably didn't help with things on that front.
And look, camera placement's tricky. If you put the camera too high, you may be giving the player too much information to discern in a way that's confusing, such as the camera in Sonic 3D Blast or Super Mario 3D World. But at the same time, if you put the camera too low, you may be cutting off too much information in a way that makes the camera just as confusing to work with. It's a real Goldilocks situation when you think about it because you need the camera to accomplish the goal of being stylish and visually appealing while also making sure that you're establishing spatial awareness for the player in a way that doesn't make them make dumb mistakes.
On top of that, Toy Story 2 is honestly a pretty forgiving game. If you're having trouble aiming at enemies because of the perspective or anything, you can always go full Beyblade mode and let it rip with your spinning move, plus the game's lack of fall damage makes failing at platforming more of a waste of time than an outright failure. It's a shame that you need these things to begin with, but things could definitely be worse. While we're on the subject of the stages though, I did fail to fully pay attention to the verticality in them earlier. It's not always there, mind you, but I got the sense that it was a deliberate choice on the part of the developers to emphasize vertical traversal in the game due to the subject matter, and it made for a really unique beast of a game. It felt like another way of subverting the more commonplace tropes of the genre because while 2D and 3D platformers definitely have and continue to emphasize verticality in their stages, it felt like something that Toy Story as a subject matter was uniquely primed to showcase. Because, like, okay, yeah, it's cute that Mario and Banjo want to go up the hill backwards or whatever the hell David Bowie was yammering about, but Buzz Lightyear takes a literal stairway to heaven in this game, you know? Being a 12-inch action figure and needing to climb a tree so that you could fight a kite is the sort of right hemisphere game design that I live for. As is needing to make your way through some platforming challenges at a construction site, navigating several fire escapes on some back alley, and store displays at Al's Toy Barn. All of these challenges are a ton of fun because they combine decent vertical level design with environment types that we're all somewhat familiar with from our everyday lives. While I was trying to find a way to properly convey what makes these levels somewhat special, I remembered that I saw a post on Reddit a couple of months ago that would serve as a perfect example of what I'm getting at. It's a simple meme from r/Sonic the Hedgehog where the original poster expressed thanks to the character for always running next to the car he was in as a kid, and the universal recognition that somewhat specific daydream got in the comments felt really validating because, like the person who posted it, I used to daydream about the same exact thing while I was growing up. And I think the same basic type of recognition is what's behind these levels. They feel especially wondrous due to how they allow the player to indulge in random things they may have dreamed about when they were younger, giving them the opportunity to hop across aisles in a store or battle inanimate objects in the way that they imagined their toys would have back when they were children. In its own, almost definitely unintentional way, it serves as reaffirming the message of the movies themselves. If one of the major themes in Toy Story 1 and 2 was the fear of obsolescence in the form of Woody getting replaced by Buzz in the first movie and later... then Toy Story 2's video game brings that point home by reminding the older people playing it what it feels like to play with toys and to have a bit of joy and wonder in their heart. To feel like the world is somehow larger than we know it to be, and to feel like things such as magic or toys coming to life looks like this and not this. Revisiting the game and enjoying it in spite of a lot of its age-related kerfuffles proves the idea of obsolescence, a major driving factor behind Woody's arcs in both movies, completely wrong. We're literally rescuing Woody in the game because he isn't obsolete.
You still worried?
About Andy? Nah, it'll be fun while it lasts.
I'm proud of you, cowboy.
Besides, when it all ends, I'll have old Buzz Lightyear to keep me company. For infinity and beyond.
Alright, so I think I've done a fine enough job of establishing the fact that Toy Story 2 is a bit of a mixed bag. I've sang its praises and done my impression of Adrian at the end of Rocky, while also critiquing the game and workshopping my impression of Meryl Streep in The Devil Wears Prada, ultimately landing on the conclusion that Toy Story 2 is a fine, but pretty unspectacular game. So why do I think you should play it?
A couple of years ago, I read an article on Forbes that really stuck out to me. The name of the piece was Mediocrity is Underrated, and it was written by senior contributor Dana Brownie for their Leadership and Careers section. In it, Brownie shares the far from original idea that it's okay to have an off day and to avoid striving for perfection with every little thing you work on. The article is basically suggesting that it's sometimes better to provide work that's quote-unquote good enough as opposed to laboring over every last detail in it. To hand in a solid B or C so that you could focus on getting the A or A+ when it really counts. Alright, like I just said, the idea is far from unique, and it's literally just telling you to pick your battles, but I actually think it's a very good piece of advice that goes far beyond career stuff. I mean, half steps like what she's describing are literally all around us, and they can lead to some pretty good stuff. For example, a writer might publish a collection of short stories to help supplement their income before dropping a more substantive novel, or how a musician might do the same with an EP as opposed to an LP. Additionally, a director might work on TV as opposed to film for a more steady paycheck, and an animated series may insert some filler to buy time for their animators to go the extra mile on an important episode or special. And that made me think about how half steps such as the ones taken by creative types or people in their careers might actually benefit those who consume media too in the form of palate cleansers. Because yeah, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to want a palate cleanser when you're doing something. You might enjoy a piece of fruit or some sorbet between meal courses, watching game shows or sitcoms for a night between viewings of more demanding and substantial films or TV shows, or playing games like Toy Story 2 between other larger and more innovative video games because it allows you to reset your expectations and general temperament. Calling something mid or mediocre has a negative connotation in the world we live in, but those words only mean that something is of ordinary or average quality. A more forgiving description of those words is to say that something's just middle of the pack in a way that leaves neither a good or bad opinion on someone. Which I realize sounds like a negative because, well, life's short and you'd think that means you should only surround yourself with things of a certain pedigree or quality, but the truth is that exposing yourself to the mediocre or mid is a great way to improve your appreciation of higher quality work. It allows you to better contemplate what you like about something by giving you a stronger frame of reference towards what you don't like. Basically, because the human brain sucks like that, it's easier to discern what you dislike about something than it is to figure out what you like about it. Something that could be pretty easily corroborated by anyone who spent more than 20 minutes on the internet. So training yourself on less than revolutionary art is a great way to learn how to become better at critiquing other things in general, as well as enjoying the truly special pieces that come your way.
Gun's done! Gun's done!
So yes, I do think you should play Toy Story 2 regardless of its problems and the fact that I consider it a bit mid. Other than the fact that it's a fun enough game, it's a title that may be able to help elevate your perception of 3D collect-a-thons. Not by being some weird-ass Cinderella that actually belonged in the pantheon of great platformers in general, but by contextualizing the true greats with an example of how they could have turned out in an alternate universe. A few months ago, I made a Chrono Trigger video and talked about how art appreciation is partially dependent on being able to adequately understand the space and time a piece of work came out in. And yeah, that's basically what I'm saying here too. The Toy Story 2s of the world set the stage for those games. Without games like it, we wouldn't know that stuff like Banjo-Kazooie or Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy are good games. I mean, we'd know that they're great, but it's entirely possible that their legacy in the medium would have been more overlooked on account of them retroactively becoming the norm for the genre as opposed to exceptions or purveyors of better design within it. But it also goes further than that because the game being part of the genre's history doesn't necessarily mean you need to play it today. It also just makes for a great palate cleanser between other games by being good enough.
Toy Story 2 is a pretty fun game and is a title that I think, had something like Blockbuster still been around and carrying titles such as this, would have been pretty easy to recommend as a rental. It's a fine enough game with just good enough music and graphics, pretty decent level designs all things considered, and just enough charm to warrant being played in between more prestigious or larger titles. And yeah, it may sound like I'm giving it the bronze medal as opposed to the silver or gold, but I mean, someone has to get the bronze medal eventually, and plus, it's still got a medal, right? On top of that, the game's available on PlayStation Plus, so if you have a subscription to that, you may as well check it out anyway. It's literally there waiting to be played. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, you leave an answer to the question of the day over in the comments, or share the video with some friends of yours that you think may enjoy it too. Stuff like that may sound like an empty gesture, but it's really not. It's like the best thing you can do to help me grow my channel. On top of that, you could also subscribe or donate to my Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon if you want to get some bonus goodies like episode commentaries, bonus videos whenever I have the chance to make them, previews of new videos before they get made, and even video answers to the question of the day. You can also check me out on social media by looking up @NichePlays on Instagram or Twitter if you want to chat about games or whatever people do on social media sites. So yeah, bye!